All right, we're like many of the other topics in this series, we're taking a forest view, the big overarching picture of what our topic is, rather than looking at individual trees. We are going to have another video on the Assyrian war machine because it's in a class by itself. But I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about what warfare was like in the ancient Near East, especially during the time of the divided kingdom in Israel. So let's take a look at that. We want to pay attention to how I'm not talking about everything that I know about war in the ancient Near East, but I want to talk a little bit about how war intersects with the passage of scripture that we're looking at. So, understanding how war worked helps us better to understand the stories and the history that we find in scripture. So we're going to look at these three topics, each in turn: military alliances and the part they played in war, military strategy and how they worked out, how their armies were arrayed, and then finally, what constitutes victory? How do you know at the end of the day that you've really won? So those are the things that we'll take a look at. First thing we want to talk about is military alliances. In ancient Israel and the ancient Near East, you often had overlord kings and vassal kings. So the overlord is usually the last conquering king, and the vassals are the ones who were conquered, but he left them in power as long as they were subject to, they were loyal to, they would send annual tribute money, then he would let them stay in charge. So you could reign over your own country, but still be subject to a higher king. And so you see that a lot in scripture with kings um, who have covenants, who have contracts, who have treaties with smaller nations. And we talked about it back. The book of Deuteronomy has a lot to say, uses a lot of that terminology between the overlord and the vassal. So the vassal kings would send tribute, would send money annually to support the overlord, and in turn, the overlord would provide security. He's not coming back to fight against you, and if somebody else tries, they're going to have to deal with him. You see, so it's a protection racket as well. And then, of course, if you're going to war with an enemy who has a pretty powerful overlord, then you would send a bribe to that overlord trying to get him to switch sides. So that would be part of all of the strategy involved in warfare, based on military alliances, what you could put together. And the three major powers during the divided kingdom stage would be Egypt, and then Assyria and Babylon. So you see in one passage, when a king is wanting to lean on Egypt, and he sends for the Pharaoh to come and help fight on the side of Judah against its other enemies. God castigates the king and says, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is a splintered reed, which means if you use a splintered reed as a cane, you're liable to get shot right through the hand with that splinter if you lean on it too heavily. And so that was God's point. You should be leaning on me because I don't fail. And to trust Egypt instead is to deliberately reject the God of Israel. And God tries to make that point. So in the ancient Near East, lots of military alliances, but for Israel, God is desiring to be their overlord, their king, and if they fear him, they need fear no one else. Not only do we have military alliances, but we have military strategy. One strategy that we see showing up in scripture again and again is psychological warfare, in which the invading army is trying to make it so horrible, so awful that you will never rebel against them again. So they will say things, send messages, they will do things, um, and as a result, people are quaking in their boots to try to fight against that kind of power. Psychological warfare. They may not be as powerful and as great as you think, but if you're shaking in your boots, they have a definite advantage. So psychological warfare was part of the military strategy. usually war had to do with a siege mentality and fighting around a walled city. So the defense had to make sure that their walls were secure, had to make sure that what was inside the walls, the water and the food, was sufficient for a prolonged siege. And then had to make sure that you too had weapons to throw on anybody who's trying to come near your wall, because if they come near your wall, they have a chance of breaching the wall in some measure, and so you have to be able to protect it. You also have to have a stronghold, a section right in the middle of your walled city that is your last-ditch effort. If the wall is breached, then the stronghold is where the resources are kept, and you run to there. So normally military strategy had to deal with that. And then other times when you were cleaning up along um, villages outside the major walled cities, you needed to know how to fight on open ground. If an army meets you there, what will you do, and how will you array your archers, your chariots, and the rest in order to fight on open ground? So all of this is involved in warfare in the divided kingdom period. Uh, so we have military alliances and military strategy. Psychological warfare, we mentioned. Here are some examples of what they would do when they uh, took your town. Sometimes humans were impaled on pikes. The stuff I'm talking about, Assyria was an expert at. So they would impale people on spikes, and they would be left hanging and dangling till death. And anybody who walked by and saw that would go, oh, whatever else, I never want that to happen to me. They would put the hooks in the captives' noses and drag them back in the way that they came, all hooked together. Um, and then often, and this happens in scripture, the king is blinded. So you stand and the enemy um, does a horrible thing in your sight, like maybe kills your daughter, and then blinds you so that the last thing you ever see is somebody killing your daughter, and that continues to reign and haunt in your memory. And so they would blind their enemies. Sometimes they would cut off appendages, put hooks in their noses, impale the captives on pikes, or drag them off into captivity, all of which is designed to make people go, war against them is horrible. I don't ever want to have that happen to me, and so I will send ahead for terms of peace before war ever breaks out. That's the idea behind psychological warfare. And then we talked about siege warfare. There's the walled cities. You got to worry about the water. You got to worry about strongholds. And then you have to worry about siege engines. These were offensive weapons that were sometimes made of iron, and they would try to push these things right up as close to the wall as they can. And then they would hurl missiles from the siege engine. The siege engine would have maybe a battering ram, and they would do what they could to try to either send missiles over the wall or batter the wall itself, while protecting them from anything thrown from the wall by the defenders of the city. So the siege engine was important for protection of the people who were on attack. And then they had what they had officers and armies who would dig under the wall to try to cause its collapse. So these people would be digging tunnels, trying to get under the wall, trying to make it weak so that it falls from its own weight and strength, and you have compromised its foundation. So that's siege warfare. You can see that a lot of thought has gone into both offense and defense in siege warfare. And then how do you know when you have won? One of the reasons that you go to war sometimes is plunder, what you can get. And so oftentimes during the divided kingdom period, Israel would suffer from invaders at harvest. And they would swing through and they would steal what you had spent the year. It's like stealing your annual salary. They would steal what you have grown and take it off for themselves, and then you would have nothing for the next year. And so to lose in that war meant famine and starvation until the next crop. And who knows when that will be or what you have to plant. So sometimes war was just about plunder. Sometimes when you won in war, you would be um, captives would be carried off. And so those captives would then serve you, and so there was that. For Assyria, they would just deport the whole city, move it somewhere else into a place where you are solely responsible and your only security is the king of Assyria. You learn real quick to be subject to the king and to want his safety so that uh, you are protected from your enemies as well. So you learn loyalty really quick. So that's victory in war. So for warfare in the ancient Near East, watch for those times when you watch the psychological warfare happening. Look for those times when they start talking about the attack of a city. Watch how important the walls are, and then watch what they do when victory is won. All right. Now for a more detailed analysis of what the Assyrian war machine looked at, catch our next video. Thanks for listening.